Welcome, Stockton University students, educators, and our community friends. My name is Susan Lang, and I'm chair of the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center Executive Committee at Stockton University. The evening of November 9th to 10th, 1938, 83 years ago, was Kristallnacht, the infamous night of broken glass in Germany and Austria, also known as the November Pogrom, when 1,408 synagogues and places of worship were simultaneously destroyed and 30,000 Jews arrested. As we begin this evening's annual Ida E. King Memorial Lecture, we remember the events of that night, Kristallnacht, 83 years ago, as the night that paved the way for the destruction of European Jewry and other victims. The tragedy of Kristallnacht was not just about the destruction of property and the mass arrest of Jews. The real tragedy was that the government that should have protected individuals and their property, in this instance, encouraged the citizens to commit violence against the Jews. Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel stated, "Kristallnacht was the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end." The lecture this evening will be presented by Dr. Michael Hayse, Associate Professor of History at Stockton University and Director of the Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey Project and Exhibition. The Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University and the Executive Committee of the Holocaust Resource Center are now actively planning for the future. One of the questions we are asking, who will tell the stories, the life stories of our local Holocaust survivors from Atlantic and Cape May counties when many will no longer be available to share their stories? Who will remember? Under the direction of Dr. Michael Hayse, with the support of Stockton's undergraduate and graduate students, the Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey Project and Exhibition began January 2019 to help the center meet the challenge of zechor, the Hebrew word for remembrance, to remember the life stories and contributions of the Holocaust survivors of South Jersey. We are honored to have Michael Hayse present to us the annual Ida E. King Memorial Lecture entitled, "On the Occasion of Remembering Kristallnacht, the November Pogrom of 1938. Please remember and reflect upon Dr. Hayes' words. He will share the influence of Kristallnacht on Jews who were impacted in Germany and Austria and were able to leave Nazi-occupied Europe and immigrate to New Jersey, to Southern Jersey. He will tell some of the life stories of Holocaust survivors who lived in South Jersey and the latest findings of a mapping project about where and how Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe were able to immigrate to South Jersey. There is an important lesson to be learned from this project. Holocaust survivors and their descendants have had a tremendous impact in our area, contributing to South Jersey's economy, educational offerings, and the continuation of the cultures and traditions brought from their homelands. Dr. Hayse, thank you for your contributions to the project, and we look forward to learning about Holocaust survivors who lived in South Jersey and were impacted by Kristallnacht. There will be a question and answer session after the lecture, moderated by Irvin Marino Rodriguez, Program Assistant in the Holocaust Resource Center. Thank you to Irvin and to Melvin Gonzalez, Stockton University undergraduate minoring in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, who are our technical crew this evening. This program is being recorded and will be available in a few weeks on the Sam and Sarah Schofer Holocaust Resource Center website and available on the Holocaust Resource Center YouTube channel. Please use the chat box this evening to pose your questions. Everyone's sound has been muted. Dr. Robert Gregg, Dean of the School of General Studies, will close the lecture, and we plan to conclude at 8:15 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that generous introduction. I'm really pleased to be giving this lecture this evening because it allows me not only to see many of my friends and colleagues on Zoom. I see that we have almost 150 people on at the moment, which is really heartening that there's so much interest in what we do at Stockton and the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center, and in particular for this project. I have been working now on this project for almost a year and a half. It is a true labor of love, and I'm very pleased to see that there are several people also on tonight with whom we've spoken about their own experiences, Holocaust survivors, or their families' experiences. Irvin Marino Rodriguez will be handling the PowerPoint. And so, Irvin, if you don't mind, I'm just going to raise my hand instead of saying next slide when we get to that point. All right. If we could just see how that works. Thank you very much. All right. So I don't know if you can see me, Irvin. So next slide. And click. This project that we're working on is an attempt to document the lives and the stories of all of the Holocaust survivors who lived in 3 counties of southern New Jersey. That's Atlantic, Cape May, and Cumberland counties. When we started in January of 2019, in January of 2019, we had a list of known survivors in our area that was roughly 125 long. We had some of their stories well documented because under the able direction of Marianne McLaughlin, now retired, and the Writing as Witness program, we've assisted over 70 Holocaust survivors in the writing of their memoirs. However, as we dug deeper, we realized that there were many more Holocaust survivors than we realized. And at present, and if you can go on to the next slide, or just click. At present, we have 1,431 survivors. We have created a database. The ultimate goal of this project is to create a digital archive, as well as a digital exhibition that can be visited at Stockton. We will, as at the current rate, I expect that we will have over 1,600 Holocaust survivors in the database altogether. These are not just the names and the information. You go on to the next. Not just the names and the information in the database, but we're collecting documentation. We've conducted well over 120 interviews so far with Holocaust survivors, those of who we have the great fortune to still have with us, despite the march of time, or their children and even grandchildren, the 2nd and 3rd generation. This is a really important project, I believe, and we are constantly being surprised by some of the information that we're finding. Over these 3 semesters, one of the things that is most important, I think, besides just recording this information before it's sort of lost, the further we get in time, the less ability we have really to collect and to catalog and then to write up the stories as narratives, which are at this time, we have many of them already in some state of completion as narratives with corresponding documentation. If you could move on. As many of you know who are from our area, many of the Holocaust survivors, in fact, at present time, well over half of those Holocaust survivors, you can move on to the next, Urban. Well over half of those survivors are, and click the next, sorry. Over half of them came to South Jersey for the opportunity to buy and operate Holocaust, back up, sorry, we're trying to coordinate this, to buy and operate poultry farms from the late 1930s when the first survivors arrived until the early to mid 1960s when the last of those poultry farms, no longer being economically viable, were closed. That was one of the primary routes that Holocaust survivors arrived in our area of mostly rural southern New Jersey. That is a story that we're telling. In the coming months, you'll be hearing a lot more about this project because we plan at this point, although we don't have a firm date at this moment, to open 2 exhibitions in the spring of 2023. One of them is a traveling exhibition on the Holocaust survivor-owned poultry farms that has been created by Allison Kisielis, who recently graduated in the spring of 2021 from our Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Irvin, could you try to go to the, because I had a photo there that captures the essence of that, and I don't know why it's not showing up. We have a photo of one of our survivors, Wolf Ehrlich, on his chicken farm. Also in the spring, George Quinn, who is an undergraduate with a major in political science, who's been working very diligently on a project that will become an exhibition at the Holocaust Resource Center in the spring, is on the businesses that were owned by Holocaust survivors in southern New Jersey. The contributions that they made are incredible. So this is just a little taste of some of the things that we're going to be doing. As I mentioned in the PowerPoint, you move on, Irvin. As I mentioned, this also comes with many opportunities for students to participate. A lot of those students who've been working on this project are on this Zoom call tonight. Every semester and over the summer, we have opportunities for students to work for credit on this project. And I found that many of the students, and I've already mentioned Allison and George, there are many, many others I don't have time to mention by name, who have continued past the first semester just because they really get hooked on this material. So if we could move on. If you'd like more information about this project, then please contact the Holocaust Resource Center or me directly about opportunities for doing research, how you can contribute. And now on to the real point of tonight's lecture. Tonight I'll be speaking about the November pogrom, as is usually called today, which is often referred to as Kristallnacht, the Nazi term for that event, which took place on the 9th and 10th of November of 1938. It was a night of, and actually several days following that night, of nationwide and organized violence that took place throughout all of Nazi Germany, which included by the fall of 1939, by the fall of 1938, also Austria, which had been annexed in Anschluss in March of that year. And I wanted to explain, just sort of expound on that a little bit. Nationwide night of organized violence. It was nationwide because the events of Kristallnacht took place from large cities with the most significant and most prominent Jewish communities like Berlin and Frankfurt and Vienna, as well as in small towns and villages throughout Germany that had sometimes just a small number of Jewish families, no significant synagogue, often just a prayer room. The extent throughout Germany, in other words, makes it a nationwide event, violent also. Violent because there were major acts of violence. Above all, the desecration and destruction of synagogues, well known and well documented. Over 1,000 synagogues throughout Germany were vandalized, desecrated, and destroyed in the course of the events of Kristallnacht. The destruction of synagogues had actually begun before Kristallnacht, but Kristallnacht really was a culmination of this welling up of more active anti-Semitic attacks on the Jewish community throughout Germany. The violence, however, wasn't just directed at places of worship. It was also directed against Jewish businesses. It was directed in a much more intimate way at families and their homes, which were violated. Many of the most harrowing descriptions of his Kristallnacht that we have from survivors come from those accounts of people huddling in basements and in attics as their homes were ransacked, overturned, objects destroyed, and while they feared for their lives. violent also because it was on Kristallnacht that the first mass roundups of Jews took place. The arrests that followed, that took place in the course of Kristallnacht in the coming days resulted in the imprisonment in prisons and concentration camps of over 30,000 Jews throughout Germany. This is in a population that when the Nazis had come to power was roughly 500,000, somewhat less than 1% of the overall population of Germany, about 0.75% of the population of Germany. Violence also changed the nature of terror in Germany. While many Jews had been persecuted and attacked in the years leading up to Kristallnacht, this organized night of violence included the first systematic roundups that were across entire towns, involving the police, involving the various different institutions of the Nazi Party, above all the stormtroopers, the so-called SA or the brown shirts, which were the forces that usually arrived at the doors of Jews of Germany and took away particularly adult men, heads of households, people of importance in the community. However, as I'll be explaining, this was not the beginning of the deportations that would take place during the war. That was another level of violence. Kristallnacht was also organized because one of the things that has to be brought to mind is the fact that the Nazi leadership coordinated every aspect of Kristallnacht, despite the fact that their own propaganda attempted to portray Kristallnacht as a spontaneous reaction of the German population, a wave of anti-Jewish sentiment that had welled up from the grassroots, when in fact it was directed from the top down, despite the fact that many Germans at the grassroots also watched and did nothing or even participated in the events. Next slide. What I would like to do tonight in particular is not to tell the overall story, the history really of the organization and perpetration of Kristallnacht, or even how it fits into the broader development of the history of the Third Reich and the steps leading up to the so-called final solution. But instead, I would like to take the perspective of the victims. So my purpose is to relate these events of the November pogrom from the perspective of German and Austrian Jews who lived in our South Jersey community once they'd escaped from Germany, once they'd escaped from Nazi-controlled Europe. The members of the community are taking the perspective of the victims is really important, because in the first years and decades after the event, much of historians' attention was directed to trying to sort of recreate and reconstruct how these events had occurred. And that's a very important goal of historians. But as we have moved on in our understanding of the events of the Third Reich and of the Holocaust, and specifically here of Kristallnacht, it's important to note that the voices of the victims themselves have moved more into the center of our understanding. And this has a purpose. So from the perspective of the victims, if I can get back to where I left off, from the perspective of the victims, one of the most important aspects of Kristallnacht is that it led to a reassessment of German and Austrian Jews' situation and next steps. from a historian's perspective, we often understand the Kristallnacht as an important fulcrum point, an important turning point from the legal and cultural anti-Semitic persecution of the first years of the Third Reich, since the Nazis had come to power in 1933. And it was a turn toward this organized violence. And in that sense, many of us understand Kristallnacht as really the turning point toward the final solution and the genocide that would be perpetrated during World War II. However, from the perspective of the victims, it's important, as historians always should remind themselves, that the actors involved, the historical actors involved, really did not know what was coming. They were in a context of increasing persecution, the legal persecution that in many ways had culminated with the Nuremberg laws, the Nuremberg race laws of 1935. But their experience has been largely free of violence and arrest. And Kristallnacht is an important turning point. And in that sense, many Jews in Germany and Austria had recognized well before Kristallnacht the danger of their situation and had sought avenues to leave the country, to emigrate. But from the very beginning, one of the largest difficulties for Jews wishing to emigrate from Nazi Germany was finding refuge. Where could they go? And not only where could they go, but what would the process of emigration involve? It meant leaving everything, the place that they'd grown up, their homes, their friends, their businesses while they still had them in the Third Reich, which was in some cases even up to and beyond Kristallnacht. And so it was a major step that meant really starting their lives over in a strange country where they might not know the language. And this would give many German Jews reason to explore possibilities for emigration, but not leave. Nevertheless, many had recognized that danger and had left. It is estimated that as many as 1/4 of German Jews had already found one way or another to get out of Germany. Some of them moving to countries adjacent to Germany, like France and the Netherlands, where they found refuge. Others able to, through connections or the regular process of obtaining visas, to get to the United States. But for those who remained, many of them were still believing that that somehow they could weather this, that Jews over the centuries had been persecuted time and again and in many different ways, and that this too might pass. Of course, from their perspective, not even the Nazis had yet dreamed up the systematic mass murder of the final solution. That wouldn't come until 1941, in the midst of World War II. The Nazis' goals were still to encourage Jews in every possible way to leave the country. But Kristallnacht is that moment when many Jews recognize that this is now an absolutely essential necessity, getting out of Germany. And we find this time and again in the testimonies that we hear. One note that I should make is that while we have 1,400, more than 1,400 Holocaust survivors in South Jersey, more than 2/3 of the survivors did not experience not just Kristallnacht, but they of course weren't German and Austrian Jews. The large majority of Jews living in Europe at the time, the large majority of Holocaust survivors as well come from Eastern Europe. And so what you see here is a map from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum that represents, that shows you the boundaries, the borders of Germany, the territory of Germany, including Austria that had been incorporated, and the parts of Czechoslovakia that had been taken over and incorporated into Germany in 1938. And so it is from this territory that it will be Jews living in these areas that we'll be speaking of today. All right. Now, what I'd like to do is share just a few short clips of some of the South Jersey Holocaust survivors and how they experienced the Holocaust. One of them is Ilse Lieser. Ilse Lieser was 10 years old when Kristallnacht had occurred. She had been born in the town of Dortmund. Her family in 1938 lived in the much larger nearby city of Cologne. Theirs was a well-integrated, one might even say assimilated family of Jews in Germany that had deep roots in the country that went back over a couple of hundred.
Okay. When did life begin to change for you in Cologne?
After Kristallnacht, after November 9th, 1938, November 10th, the night of November 9th to 10th.
Tell me about that.
Well, at that point I was at the Yavne, which is a Jewish high school, and there was an Orthodox synagogue connected to it. And we didn't, as children, really didn't know that much. We knew there had been destruction and stores had been, Nazis or the Germans had attacked Jewish people and had ruined store windows. There was glass all over the streets. That some of our friends had been arrested, some Jewish friends. I have very vague recollection, except that when we got to high school and we saw the synagogue, which was right next to it, was totally been burned out. And we came home, and I remember that my mother was crying, and because, I don't know, I think right then and there, maybe while I was away, the Germans had come in and had arrested my father and sent him, well, subsequently we found out they sent him to Dachau. And I remember it was a horrible time. I mean, as a young child, I could just feel all this turmoil and this commotion, and knowing that it was very serious, and we had to get out. My mother was crying, and then we found out my father's brother had been sent to another concentration camp in Oranienburg, which is near Berlin. And my uncle, who's here now, was sent to Buchenwald. So the next few days were horrible, absolutely horrible.
What do you remember of the night of Kristallnacht?
The night itself, I don't remember anything. We didn't have any damage to our apartment.
Were you aware of what was happening that night? Not
that night, next morning. Not until the next morning when I went to school. And then I think when I came home, my father had been arrested. He was no longer there. That particular night, I didn't know until I woke up in the morning and went to school.
And where was your father taken?
Dachau.
For how long?
For a few weeks. During that time, my mother was frantic, of course, and she tried to find out where he was. We didn't know immediately where he was. It took a while. And then she tried to find how to get him out. Trying to explain to the German powers that be, I don't know, that he had been a World War I, soldier fighting at the front lines. Nothing really worked until she contacted a friend in Holland and asked her if she could possibly send us some sort of a letter saying that we could stay with her, because we needed to get him out. It turned out that eventually they would have let him go anyway, because the Germans weren't quite ready for whatever the final solution was. So they let them all go. But
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. We do have a question in the chat, and I think you're getting to it. Who is Elsa Lieser, and what is her connection to the project?
All right. Ilse Lieser was a German Jew. She was 10 years old at the time of Kristallnacht. She was born in 1928, as I mentioned before, in the town of Dortmund. And like the other people in the project, her family, including Ilse, came to South Jersey after they got out of Germany. In her case, the family was able to get out before World War II. They were able to get on a boat, come to the United States in 1939. They had distant relatives who had sponsored them into the United States. And ultimately, during the war, I believe it was 1941 or 1940 or 1941, the family was able to buy, with the assistance of the Jewish Agricultural Society, which offered a low interest loan, a farm in Vineland, New Jersey. That was a poultry farm where they raised chickens and sold eggs. Like many of the South Jersey survivors, that was their experience. The leasers, however, came already during the war. And so that is a rather typical experience, all right? Again, all of the people that we're dealing with, that I'm using tonight, and I only have time really for a couple. I've got 3 or 4 others that I'd like to talk about. All of them ended up living in South Jersey for some period, in these cases, an extended period of their lives, and became American citizens and so on. All right, these are stories that, of course, other Holocaust survivors who were German and Jewish Jews, German and Austrian Jews, had as well in other parts of the country and the world, who were able to escape from Nazi Germany. Of course, not all survivors came before or during the war. What I'm trying to represent here, trying to demonstrate sort of with the case of Ilse Leeser, is that the family had considered leaving the country earlier, but hadn't felt that it was as desperate or dire. In the rest of her testimony, she also explains, the sort of conversations that her parents had, as well as with other family members around the dinner table, talking about their options, right? But they really didn't find that they had any good options. And then with Kristallnacht, and this is the typical experience, they now realize they have to get out, and they're lucky enough to be able to do so. All right. One of the things that is a typical, rather typical as well, is the arrests of the heads of household. You heard that many of the men in her extended family were arrested and sent to different concentration camps. Right. Again, while this raises our, understanding of the Holocaust, of deportations, in almost all cases, those Jews who were arrested were released after a few days or a few weeks, at most usually a few months, well before the war broke out in the fall of 1939. And that's important because the arrest in 1939 was not really, in that sense, in terms of policy, the prelude for mass murder, for deportations to mass murder. Again, that hadn't yet been conceived or implemented. What it was an act of terror to try to terrorize the remaining German Jews to get out of the country, right? Because their hope was to make Germany, as they called it, free of Jews through emigration. And that was proving for them a far too slow process, all right? Some were desperate in other ways. I'd like to share a clip from a different Holocaust survivor, from the Berg family. This is Jill Berg, who became after
My
American.
grandmother was in the car with my grandfather. My grandmother was in a cast. She had broken her leg. And took us in the car and they couldn't calm us down because the shul, like I said, was 2 blocks away. We saw the fire. It terrified us. So we had panic attacks. We were terrified. So my grandmother put us on the ground of the car, put her feet on us, and we didn't see anything. That's not true. I did sneak up and I saw more burning on the way.
So you saw fires.
I saw fires, and they terrified me.
Did you see people milling around in the streets?
No.
or
I didn't see anything like that.
No black shirts, no brown shirts.
We were afraid to look out the window. We weren't allowed to look out the window. That's why my uncle wanted to close the shutters. And they took us away. They took us to Cologne. And my mother, in the tape that I typed up, my mother says we were leaving the front door. We were exiting. She and my father and my Uncle George were exiting the front door of the house, and the Nazi destroyers were coming in the back door. So they didn't leave a minute too soon. Because had they caught them, they would have taken them to Schul. And what they were doing with them in Schul is they picked up all the men and they took them to Dachau and to Buchenwald. Now that was a very bad thing. Not only because of what went on in Dachau and Buchenwald, but because it was like a camouflage of things to come. They let them out. They let all these people out again after 6 weeks. They tortured them beyond belief. When they came out, many of them didn't speak. And those that did speak, nobody believed. But my father didn't want to be tested. He was petrified. They were petrified. And I still think that that's what saved us, their fear. Not everybody was as frightened as they were. And
Okay. Jill Pauley and her family have a rather unique experience. And that is that, as you heard there, they were able to leave their house right before the Nazis arrived. In fact, just as the Nazis were arriving at their home to ransack it, but also to arrest their father and the other men in the family. They went into hiding for over a week in Germany, while through contacts, they discovered a way to get out and across the border to the Netherlands. Once in the Netherlands, the Berg family was able to actually bribe their way into getting special visas to the only place that they could find to escape to, and that was to the African country of Kenya. And it took them some time to be able to work out the details, but eventually they were able to leave on a ship that was flying under a Kenyan flag, the Umbara, which took them to Kenya, and they spent the entire war years, and this was an extended family ultimately of over 12 people. They went in 3 waves in the summer of 1939. It was rather harrowing escape, actually, because when they did leave, the outbreak of World War II was impending, and had they not left when they did, just weeks later, the borders would have been closed as a result. The Bergs spent the entire war years in Kenya. They were able to buy a farm. Many family members, as well as acquaintances, were able to make it to Kenya as well. Survived on that farm. And only after World War II in 1946 did the extended Berg family, and I have a photograph, the extended Berg family were able to make it to the United States, to get passage to the United States. They bought a farm, again, a poultry farm, started over with almost nothing in 1947. It took them about a year until they came to South Jersey. And they spent many of them the rest of their lives. They got married, they became important citizens in Cumberland County. So that's the story of the Bergs. I think I have time. I'm looking at my watch. I have one more story that I would like to share, and that is somebody who's actually in the audience, and that is Eugene Gottlieb. Is Eugene with us today?
Yes,
Yes, he is,
saw
Dr.
Eugene. Yes.
All right, so shout out to Eugene Gottlieb. Eugene, I'm not going to share the clip because I see that the time is rather short. Eugene Gottlieb was born in 1933 in Germany. His parents were Elsa and Leo Gottlieb. They lived in a small town of Wenningen. Their families had lived there for many generations. Important members of a very small Jewish community in a very small town. And in fact, his family was a family of, among other things, cattle traders, which was a not uncommon occupation for Jews in rural small town Germany. When Kristallnacht occurred, as was common, Leo, Eugene's father, was arrested. The family was told that they had to leave the very next day. They were put on a bus to leave. His father, rather than being taken like others to a concentration camp, which probably would have been Dachau, was put in a prison in a neighboring town. And as the bus was leaving, they were able to get their father. Their father was reunited with them from that prison, put on a bus. They made it out of Germany. Leo remembers spending the night hiding in a neighbor's barn, sleeping in a wine barrel. These were really desperate moments. And one of the things Eugene tells us is that on that bus, his uncle, who had served in World War I, and was like many others, was quite proud of that fact, and for that reason also quite particularly sort of disturbed by the fact that Jews in Nazi Germany were being treated the way that they were. On that bus, his father, his uncle, sang the German national anthem, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, as sort of a demonstration to those who are watching the bus leave, of basically, his belonging and his patriotism. So these are just a few of the stories. Eugene, I apologize for not being able to show the whole clip, but I want to leave some time for questions. The point is that with Kristallnacht, there's a whole different level of threat assessment that the remaining Jews of Germany face. The desperation to get out of the country leads them to, and we have South Jersey survivors who fit all of these categories, who come directly to the United States, who go through Palestine for a time before they come to the United States, sometimes before, sometimes after the war. We've heard about the Bergs, and with them another family, the Katzensteins, that spent the war years in Africa. And many, and those who were in Europe. And there are, of course, many others who followed these trajectories to try to escape from Nazi Germany, and either were unsuccessful at escaping and did not survive the Holocaust because they were caught up in the Nazi genocide during the war, or they endured and survived the camps and they came to the United States or elsewhere, but for us in South Jersey, to the United States after World War II. Really, every story is unique. They tell us a lot about the events, and by listening to the voices of the survivors, we really get a sense of that immediacy of decision-making, not knowing what's going to come next, right? Trying to figure out what is the best route moving forward. And so really, this is just one of the small aspects that we can glean from the many survivors of South Jersey that tells about one small but very important chapter of the persecution of Jews and ultimately of the Holocaust in Germany during the war. I look forward to sharing a lot more of these stories with you in the future. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. If anybody, I have so many more examples I could share.
Yes, Dr. Hayse, thank you. We do have a lot of questions, so hopefully we can get through most of them tonight. But the first one is from someone in the audience. Dr. Hayse, you have shared stories of Holocaust survivors from Cumberland and Cape May counties. Do you have a quick story of a Holocaust survivor from Atlantic County?
From Atlantic County. We do. I'm trying to think of one of our Atlantic County survivors who actually, like many of the Atlantic County survivors, came after the war as refugees. And so off the top of my head, yes, I could look up many examples. But if we could move on to the next question, I'm having a little bit trouble coming up with that name.
Sure, of course. The second question deals with the project in itself. This is from a high school student. How were you able to find the Holocaust survivors in these counties to include in the project? What resources did you use?
Okay, that's a really good question. We look wherever we can. And so some of the resources that we have used, we begin, of course, with the list of those whose memoirs we have. But we speak to people in the communities. Every time that we interview one of our Holocaust survivors, we also ask them who else they knew who was also a refugee or a survivor of the Holocaust, who lived, their neighbors essentially. And if they had chicken farms, we plot those on the maps. There have been attempts in the past to try to identify Holocaust survivors that haven't been quite as systematic and quite as dedicated, I guess, as ours, although they've really done yeoman's work, really great stuff. In Cumberland County, there was a group around some teachers in the Vineland area, some of whom themselves were the children of Holocaust survivors. We have contacts with a journalist whose grandmother grew up on a poultry farm in South Jersey. Grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. And he's been working on a book. So he has done some of his own research that he shared with us, and he came up with names. We have gone, and we're still in the process of completing that. We go through the local newspapers. The team, the students and I, we've spent many days in the archives at Temple University, where they have the newspapers of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey, because there's some newspapers that are not digitized. And in particular, I'm thinking of the press of it, the Jewish Record of Atlantic City. And by going through that, we'll find articles, and particularly what's very helpful is also obituaries, that explain where people were from or a little bit about their history. And so we add them. Once we have an idea that people might be survivors, whether somebody's told us about it, whether we found an article or an obituary, then we use the various different tools. One of the things that's been very helpful is to use ancestry.com, but we also will take those names and we'll the other local papers to try to find other documentation. It's really a laborious process, but it's very interesting. So that's why we keep adding new names. We have visited also the cemeteries, the Jewish cemeteries of Southern New Jersey. And, we have spent some time trying to determine which of who's interred, of the people who are interred there, who were Holocaust survivors. When did they arrive in our area? Where are they from? Again, it takes a lot of detective work. But the students have been really absolutely fantastic. I think they're learning a lot of skills. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. And I know that I also wanted to mention that we're also using the oral history testimonies that were recorded in the mid to late 1980s of Holocaust survivors from Atlantic and Cape May counties. We have approximately 65 of these oral history testimonies in Stockton University's special collections, and they've been very powerful to listen to and important for this project. In continuation of that previous question, a community member is asking, how will the findings of the South Jersey Holocaust Survivor Project be shared with the communities in South Jersey or at the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center?
That's a good question. All right, in a number of different ways, as I've said, we're going to have ongoing exhibitions, smaller exhibits, and events that are going to highlight some various different aspects of our South Jersey Holocaust survivor community. As I mentioned, there are going to be a couple of those that you'll be hearing about in the spring semester of 2022 coming up. There will be lectures as well. And once the project goes live, which again, I estimate is going to be in the spring semester of 2023. So it's going to take us another year and a half, because right now we're still in the collecting and writing phase, and then ultimately we need to develop it. But for a variety of different reasons, it's going to be shared for with those who will need to come to Stockton University, or at least contact us in order for us to share it. We have, it's basically a decision that I have made that I think is justifiable for a variety of different reasons. This is not going to be something that's going to go up on the internet, because that way we lose a lot of the sort of control over content and how it's shared. So that for researchers, for students who are working on projects, for community members, for family members who want to find out about their maybe parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, they can come to Stockton and get access to all of the material that we are collecting and organizing and going to make available.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. And I do want to mention that a lot of the Stockton University students are on this Zoom meeting, and as well as many of the second and third generation after the Shoah are also here, and we've interviewed them. And this question that a high school student is asking is one of the questions that we also ask. And it's, were any of the Holocaust survivors that we have archived reluctant to share their story?
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, for us, what that often means, just because of the march of time, and when we're getting started, the large majority of our Holocaust survivors of South Jersey are no longer with us, and so what they shared in some sort of way that's been captured and has been made available to us is really for us extremely valuable. It's meaningful. It's impactful. But if they didn't share it when they're alive, in any sort of a written way or through oral testimonies that were videotaped, which some did, then we have to get it at that through an indirect means. And one of those means is to speak with their children and grandchildren. And, a standard question that we ask the second and third generation is, when they were growing up, did their parents or grandparents speak to them about their events, about their life experiences before, during, and after the war? And many of them say, no, not really. Obviously, to speak about it brought up often very difficult, painful memories. They often wanted to protect their children by not sharing sort of these horrible acts of sort of human cruelty. And for that reason, sometimes we just do not have a good account of what their experiences were during the war. Fortunately, however, one of the things that makes our project unique is that we're also interested in their post-war lives very much, because for us, these survivors are not defined exclusively, solely, or even primarily by their Holocaust experiences, by their experiences of persecution as victims. We see them as members of our community, as neighbors. And so what they experienced, what they did in South Jersey after World War II is every bit as important to us. All right. And I think that's really valuable. One of the things that we're working on as well is to emphasize that these survivors were also refugees, right? And that if we understand them as refugees and not just as Holocaust survivors, they fit into a much larger category, right? And their experiences have a sort of a different level of meaning and importance as refugees, as we're talking a lot about current events that deal with refugees, not just Jewish refugees of Nazi persecution during the war. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. And this is actually a question from I believe a Pleasantville High School student. What are some of the challenges you and your team have faced creating this database of Holocaust survivors?
It's a good question, and many of them. There are gaps in the information, as I suggest already. There are gaps in the documentary record. As a historian, I know we deal with this all the time. You have to work with the sources you've got, and so that is really one of the biggest problems. But added to that, I have to say that it was both a curse, but in some ways also a blessing, that this project began just as the coronavirus was beginning to make its rounds, and upend our world. And so we've been conducting most of this research while the pandemic has been going on. And so that in itself might not be what you were thinking of, has been an important obstacle. It means all of our interviews, almost all of our interviews, have been on Zoom. We've done much of the research that we're able to do without going in person to the archives, although we started that now as well. We spent many summer days in the archives, as I mentioned before, at Temple University, for example. So that's one of the biggest, and really just identifying the survivors themselves, right? It's sort of a painstaking labor to go through the impartial and imperfect records that we've got and try to sort of connect dots so that we have not just a few data points, but that we have enough material so we can actually create a narrative of people's lives, at least a few paragraphs that sort of summarizes what people experienced before, during, and after the Holocaust.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. I believe this is also another question from a high school student. Was there anything that surprised you or your team while creating this database and working on the project?
Is there anything that surprised me? There are a lot of things that surprised me. There's so many that I'm not surprised that I'm surprised very often by what I experience. And for people who don't work in this field, I should say that one of the biggest surprises, one of the most heartening surprises, is that most of the survivors, despite all of the experiences they've gone through, and we've touched mostly on those who were able to, who didn't experience the camps, the wartime camps, who didn't experience the ghettos, sort of near-death experiences, but even those who did, that they came, so many of them have come through with really positive outlooks on life, where one would think after going through all of this, people would be understandably quite bitter, right? Certainly there is sometimes some of that, but the degree to which these are happy people who devote themselves to their families and to their communities, who really sort of embrace life. It's a real pleasant surprise. There are a lot of other things I could say when it comes to surprises. I'm sometimes surprised at individual stories. I mentioned the Bergs and the Katzensteins who went through Kenya, right? Things that I know this happened, but the fact that we have survivors in our community, who have sort of that life story, is sort of a revelation to me. And again, if you look at the stories of emigration and escape from Nazi Germany, if it's one of the stories that you've heard in testimonies about the Holocaust, there are almost always people here in South Jersey who are Holocaust survivors who shared some aspect of that experience. So yeah, I could go on and on. There's so many surprises. It's one of the things that makes a historian's work, but especially in this field, really gratifying, is that it never gets old. It is really fascinating, and every story unique, new, and exciting in its own way.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. And if I can just chime in, I grew up in Atlantic City, and rediscovering this history of the resilience of these Holocaust survivors who were community leaders, and how one person made a difference, and they worked to make a difference not just for themselves and their families, but to a future that unfortunately they never saw. And so that just always surprises me every week, is learning about a Holocaust survivor who had a shop in Atlantic City that I remember seeing growing up, but it's just made it all worth it, all the work. But we do have a question, and this came up several times. So thank you to all the Stockton University students that have asked this. As a Stockton University student, is there a way to possibly get involved with the project?
There are many ways to get involved with the project. If you're interested in working on this project, definitely contact the Holocaust Resource Center or me directly. And Irvin, I'd be happy if you just want to put in the chat my email address. I'd really like to hear from you when you talk about the possibilities. If you are a student in the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, which I think is probably one of the most important institutions next to the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton, then I'm teaching a seminar in the spring semester that's going to be devoted to work on this project, really a hands-on work, doing the investigative historical research, but also the write-ups, the sort of what we call public history, sort of turning these stories into narratives that can be presented with documentation to a broader public. And if you're interested in doing that as a master's student, you can do that. If you're an upper level undergraduate with a good GPA, you don't need to be a history major. You can also take the graduate level seminar. I'd be happy to have you join that seminar. You'll need special permission if you're an undergraduate, but we can work that out. If you meet the qualifications, just reach out to me. If you're an undergraduate, every semester I have a team of students, and many of them are on the call tonight. It's a pleasure working with them. Many of them are taking the working on the project as an independent study, which means they sign up for a special project that's a credit-bearing project. It goes on their transcripts just like any other course. It's as much or more work than any course that you might do. But again, I think you'll find it fascinating if you do it. We meet weekly. On a regular, every week during the semester, you'll have your own project, but you'll also be doing some of the research on the broader project, for the team. So it's always a great team of graduates, undergraduates. Irvin and other staff members are also often there. Irvin's really one of our important members of the South Jersey Holocaust Survivor Project team. So yes, if you're interested, there are many ways that you can take part. You can also just volunteer. If you volunteer, I would like to ask that you actually show up regularly and not just when you feel like it, because we value your work, but we have to be able to count on you doing some of the things, the tasks that you're given. But I think that once you start, you'll see it's really fun. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Hayse. And on that note, we're going to move on to Dean Gregg, who will be our concluder for tonight. But I do want to remind at least our team who was on this interview with Dr. Andrew Rennie, his father, a Holocaust survivor, Marcel Rennie, his motto, do a good deed every day. So thank you, Dean Gregg.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Dr. Hayse, Michael, for an excellent presentation. I think you demonstrated tonight just some of the great strengths of this format that we're using, but also some of the difficulties and some of the clunky technology. If I'd been in your position, I would have been just falling apart, and you acted like a consummate professional that you are. So I have to congratulate you on that. But the last part, I want to keep my part brief because I don't want to take away from that last section where you and Irvin, you were answering the questions, because that could have gone on for an hour, I'm sure, and everyone would have been extremely enlightened by it. And that's a tribute to you as a historian. I've been your colleague now for 25 years, and I have to say that I have, in that time, learned so much from you, and you demonstrate every time you speak. And you've done so much, particularly for the study of Holocaust and Genocide studies at Stockton, because it really was in its infancy when you arrived. And there's just the manner in which you established yourself, worked with Gail Rosenthal and the Holocaust Resource Center, and everybody in the community, and did so many of those tours with her, one of which I was very fortunate to go on myself. You have educated so many people, and it comes through when you start talking about students. You kind of, your eyes light up, and just knowing that you've had such an influence on people as a result of that. So that's my first comment, is basically to thank you for all that you've done. Tonight was a wonderful presentation of some incredible work that you're doing that I think will have a huge impact into the future. And it's just so great that so many graduates, undergraduates can benefit from being a part of this. So, I'm hoping that you go to bed at night congratulating yourself on all the labors that you've had over the years, and all the great work that you've done, and particularly in this project. So that's one thing. And I was just reminded when you were talking of the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, who was a leading influence in psychology, who, when he was asked about how he managed to survive all of the hardships of his experience in the Holocaust, I think he referred to Nietzsche's comment about committing himself to the why, or allowed him to deal with the how. In other words, by having a purpose, he was able to overcome all the horrors of how things were done to him and so forth. And I got that sense from these survivors that you were talking about, that, and sometimes that was not something that would benefit them. If they had that commitment to a purpose, it might be a purpose that would lead them into trouble, a purpose to resist, or a purpose to stay where they were and not make a move to leave. But on the other hand, when they get to South Jersey, they have a purpose to kind of overcome the violation that they've been through in the Kristallnacht and in their whole experience, and make their purpose their families and their farms and surviving. And so I got a real sense from that purpose, and I think Irvin at the end very nicely used the word resilience, which I think speaks to that. So it's a great project on purpose and resilience, overcoming hatred and just horrific behavior by the worst of humanity. So I really want to thank you for bringing that to us tonight, and that's really all I have to say at this point. So thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. Sorry about the difficulties with the technology. These things happen, but it's always a little bit unnerving. So,
as director of the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center, thank you all. We had close to 200 participants tonight, and you stayed with us the whole evening. We thank you. We're honored to have you this evening, and stay safe, be well, and keep in touch. And thank you all for always supporting our projects here at the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center. Have a good evening, everyone. And a special thank you to all our high school students and Stockton University students. Thank you.